Starting your event now.
Okay, everybody. Well, welcome to this RUSI cyber event. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Conrad Prince. I'm a fellow here at RUSI and help to lead the RUSI Cyber Research Programme. I'm delighted today to welcome Max Smeets, who is joining us to talk about some of the themes in his new book, No Shortcuts: Why States Struggle to Develop a Military Cyber Force. Max will be a very familiar name to anyone who's reading about offensive cyber and cyber more generally. I think he's certainly one of the more grounded and one of the most thoughtful commentators on the topic. So it's great to have him with us here today. He's senior researcher at the Center for Security Studies in Zurich, director of the European Cyber Conflict Research Initiative, and an affiliate at Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation. Now, this is a hybrid event. We've got some guests here in person, so thank you for joining us, and also several hundred joining us online. Max is going to speak for about 20 minutes, after which I will kick off with a couple of questions. And then we'll open it to questions more broadly, so people in the room can put theirs directly, and we'll have a microphone that will circulate. If you're dialing in, please put any questions you've got in the Zoom Q&A function, and then you can do that throughout the event, and I will moderate those and put some to Max when the time comes, and try and get as good a balance as I can between in the room and online questions. Just to say, this event is entirely on the record. It's on the record. So both Max's remarks and then the Q&A are all going to be on the record. So with that, I'm delighted to hand over to Max Smeets. Thank you.
Thank you, Conrad, for the kind introduction, and congratulations to James Sullivan and the rest of the team for setting up such a terrific program here at RUSI and doing all the incredible work. Also nice to see so many familiar faces here in the audience. So the book is based on or starts off from a dual observation. The first observation that I'm making is that we have seen the institutionalization of military cyber efforts. So what we have seen over the past decades, and particularly the last decade, is a growing number of states establishing not just or writing a cyber strategy and cyber defense strategy, but also establishing a cyber command, and many of them with an offensive mandate. And whilst we have seen this, and of course these organizations are set up sometimes in a variety of different ways, we have seen actually relatively few states conducting cyber effect operations. So cyber effect operations here are those operations that seek to disrupt, deny, degrade, and/or destroy. Now, following these two observations that are quite widely held also in the academic and policy research community, people have gone into kind of a variety of directions to study why this is the case. The one direction very much focuses on the coercive nature of cyber operations. But the argument is, well, actually, cyber operations are rather lousy coercive tools. And as a result of it, we rarely see them actually being used. The signaling nature of cyber operations is not as significant as some people may think it is, and hence there is no value in usage of it. The other argument that you frequently hear is about, well, cyberspace is actually really an intelligence contest. And so what we really have to study is not those effect operations, but it's about espionage. And so in this argument, you get one I've also made myself and connects to it with Richard Hartnett. Well, it's actually about activity taking place below the threshold of armed attack, but it can strategically still be meaningful, particularly if this takes place in a cumulative manner. A number of different arguments there as well. Well, you can also argue cross-domain deterrence works. For instance, that's something that John Lindsay has said in his latest book. Particularly the high-end cyber operations, they are simply deterred because you can also more easily respond with maybe conventional means. And the last frequent argument heard is, well, there's a norm against it. Particularly the more democratic states don't see or believe it's not normative to use cyber effect operations. I'm not so much disagreeing with the literature, but I'm saying, well, that's fundamentally based on one key assumption, and that's that states have crossed the barriers of entry and are actually able to conduct cyber effects operations in the first place. But they haven't studied that element in any great detail. And so the purpose of this book is to do this. And the key argument here is, of course, as the title suggests, is that states struggle to develop a military cyber force, and that the time and resources required to do so are much more higher than is often appreciated. And the way that I've tried to do this in the book is through a number of different steps. So this book is not one which has a theory chapter and then 3 case studies, but instead what I'm doing is the first part of this book, of course, discusses a wide range of definitions. What are cyber effect operations? How do they link to espionage operations? Those questions. And which countries have we exactly seen establishing different types of cyber commands or other military entities, and how do they interact with the intelligence services? But then I'm doing the next 2 chapters. I'm discussing one key element that, of course, very much comes back in the UK discourse as well, and that is that constrained actors have the requirements for constrained actors are way higher to conduct cyber operations than for unconstrained actors. We can talk about constraints. I define them here in organizational, legal, and strategic constraints, but that's a key part that I discussed there. Now, if I'm right on that, what I then do is establish a framework for capacity development and discuss what is actually required to develop an offensive cyber capacity, look at how this changes over time, look how states can connect and interact and coordinate their capability development, and finally look at the role of the private sector. Because perhaps if the incentives between states to cooperate are low, perhaps the private sector can play a role. Now, I don't have time to discuss all of these different arguments in the different chapters of the book. So what I kind of thought is I wrote down a kind of few points that I thought to start the conversation here to make. The first one is perhaps the most basic one, and that's how we conceptualize cyber capability development, but we have to start from there. And what we see is that still too often, capability development is misrepresented, where we hear that cyber weapons can be sold or that cyber weapons can be launched, all of those issues. But of course, fundamentally, what we're talking about with cyber operations is a series of activities for which you may or may not use certain tools at a given point in time to establish whatever you want to establish on a certain target network or system. And what I do in the book is distinguish between 5 key categories in terms of capability development. And I call this the patio framework. The first one are people. The second one are exploits. The third one are tools. The fourth one are infrastructure. And the fifth one is the organization. Of those 5, no question, people is the most important, right? And we're not talking here about what in some language would be seen as the hackers. So specifically your vulnerability analysts, your operators, your developers, or maybe even some system administrators, but of course a much wider number of people that I'm sure many of you in the audience are aware of, your strategists, your legal experts, your consultants, your front office, and so on. Now, if it is the case, and that people are the most important element of this framework, of course, when we think about capability development, the key question is about recruitment, retention, and training of personnel, right? Okay, and if that's the case, let's go to the second point. The second point is there is a very much overlooked element link between your strategic posture that you see in many states and the ability to retain, train, and recruit the right people. What's that link? So the link here is what we see looking at the majority of military cyber commands that have been established, is that they still only have a mandate to operate in wartime. In peacetime, they're actually not even allowed to do reconnaissance. So one example would, for instance, be the Dutch Defense Cyber Command. Whilst being established for many years, you've got a command with only a mandate to operate in wartime. And in peacetime, it's not even allowed to gain access to foreign networks to potentially see which targets they actually may want to achieve an effect on in case the need arises, or get an understanding of the environment in which they want to operate. Now, if that is the case, you can imagine with these limited mandates where you can't fight day-to-day basis, the struggles of then actually training the right people up and make sure that you retain them. Because that's, of course, also the key way in which you have brought many of them in, which is, you can do stuff here that you can't do somewhere else. I'm happy to develop and discuss this point in greater detail in the Q&A on to what degree then, the reserve forces or exercises or training infrastructure, or of course, the integration with intelligence can minimize that gap. But it's a very prominent one that you see across certainly all states in continental Europe, and one that I would argue, I can't think of a state that has truly resolved this issue. The third one is, and I don't have to say this to this UK audience, is that there are obvious benefits to organizational integration between the military and intelligence at an operational level. So not just a dual-headed position that you see in the US, where you may have, a commander being both heading the NSA and cyber command. The benefits are numerous, whether this is allowing for the ability to not just transfer explicit knowledge, but also tacit knowledge, the type of knowledge that can't be easily communicated. The scaling up provides opportunities for specialization. Of course, there is also opportunities for both more effective use of both tooling and infrastructure. But I just wanted to highlight that there are a number of risks there as well, and some of them have been showcased in the past. To pick out one here is that, of course, the overlapping capability development and usage may initially seem resource efficient, but down the line have significant consequences. So to put this in context, the most obvious and prominent case is, of course, the equation group that some have attributed to the NSA and the cluster around Stuxnet, where you see in effect-based operations against the nuclear centrifuges in Natanz, where a lot of resources has been put in to just develop the malware relevant for Stuxnet, but it was connected to a whole range of course, very sophisticated espionage platforms that actually required a lot more time. You could, at least from the code base, suggest time to develop. Thinking about Doku 2.0, Flame, Mini Flame, a wide range of capabilities that perhaps would have been discovered if Stuxnet wasn't used. But I would argue the chances of discovery would have been much, much, much lower if it wasn't for this very prominent effect operation with very clear consequences would have taken place. And so what you see here, because of the overlap in intelligence and what you can call military capabilities here, or at least an effect-based operation, yes, it seemed initially maybe efficient, but down the line, you've put all your eggs in one basket and you saw the significant consequences of it as a result of it. Let me make one or two more points. And the next one is about the incentive structure for actually transferring capabilities. When you normally think about transferring capabilities between militaries, there is a very well-known kind of understanding or prominent understanding of when it does and does not take place. In simple terms, states are much more likely to transfer actual weapons or the ability at most to reproduce certain weapon systems. What states are much less likely and willing to do is giving other countries the opportunity to innovate or further develop these capabilities. And that's, of course, for a number of reasons. One, the opportunity to do so is much higher. You can lock in alliances. You don't create future competitive markets against yourself, and you don't allow for extreme autonomy maybe of your alliance members. Now, the question is, to what degree that is actually the case for cyber? And my argument is, well, this logic perhaps is not completely reversed, but it's certainly very different. And particularly when you look at your tooling and your exploits, because of their transitory nature, there are they become what I would call rivalrous goods, and they become the incentives for sharing are really limited. Now, I've used a couple of terms here. What do I mean with transitoriness here? So I mean here that not just your exploits and tools are limited in the time in which you can use them, and they can differ greatly depending on how you use them, but also indeed how your usage of them greatly affects the chances of being able to use them in the future. Now, if that is the case, you can see that what we call with rivalrous goods in economics is that my consumption of a good influences potentially your consumption of a good. In this case, the incentives for sharing, particularly if they're used in an effect-based operation, not an intelligence operation, have reduced significantly. And in the book, I explain only in a few narrow situations in which you can still benefit from transferring those. Now, if there are then reasons or opportunities for sharing, I would argue they are much more in the allowing other actors to innovate or develop their own capacity, which is much more in the training and infrastructure realm. And I think we have seen a little bit of that. Yes, you may have an event organized by NATO CCD COE, locked shields, where a number of different countries can participate and send their blue team, but to no significant extent have we really seen this today. And if I would think about future cooperation, there's clearly one element there where particularly these incredibly costly training facilities and setups, where most of the European countries have insufficiently invested in, there is a very good opportunity, despite there are still some limits of sharing, to really do much more of that burden sharing together that is insufficiently going on today. My last point is a minor one. And that's about the need to refocus the discussion around cyber arms control and cyber disarmament. I've talked a couple of times now about my book, and I tend to get a question around this. Why do we need to refocus? If I look at where the debate stands still today, it's very much on one aspect, which is the usage of 0 days and the potential disclosure of 0 days by states. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have a discussion about this at all, but I hope from the book, one of the elements that becomes clear is that, first of all, the usage of 0 days itself is way more limited than people think it is. It's fundamentally cyber operations about understanding the target network better than the target knows themselves. And you may sometimes use exploits and specifically 0 days for that, but more often than not, you don't need to. And so there is a question itself on the uses of 0 days. But secondly, as I've hoped to discuss in the book, as well, there are actually a lot more important elements thinking about how states develop their capacity that we should focus on. And of course, one of them is, well, start with yourself on your people's management, where still remarkably many countries today don't have a very good management as to when people have worked for a military organization where they are not allowed to go to after. But these are the kind of essential building blocks or losses of capacity later on that haven't fully spelled out yet. And I think one of the areas there is obvious on again, a more diversification of elements where we have to look at when we look at arms control and cyber disarmament. I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to touch upon any of these issues in more detail in the Q&A or touch upon anything else in the book.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Max. That's really great. And a really interesting book and well worth reading, I would say. So we've got some questions coming in. Again, if you're online, please put your questions in the Zoom Q&A function. I'll turn to the audience in a second. But I mean, just to sort of kick off from me, I mean, I guess one of the things that struck me most about the book, one of the individual points, is that there's a kind of narrative generally now that, the increasing availability of cyber capability, whether that's commercially through companies like NSO Group, whether it's through leaks, whether it's through closer collaboration between criminal groups and nation states of different sorts, all of these factors are kind of lowering the bar. They're making it easier for nations to get involved in cyber activity, whether for espionage or for attack. And I think you're saying kind of the reverse. You're challenging that narrative. So I just wondered if you wanted to sort of say a little bit more about that. And also particularly, is it different between democracies and what we might call hostile states? So do you think the challenges involved are significantly different if you're a hostile state with arguably fewer constraints, or is this a picture that you see across the board?
Yeah, so let me start with your second kind of question is, yes, we should definitely distinguish between what I would call more constrained states and unconstrained states, and the requirements to then operate differ enormously. So just a simple question on what are the barriers of entry? Well, they really differ on your constraints significantly. And of course, in the West, most of them are highly constrained, perhaps too constrained. We can have a debate on that too. And as a result, it requires significant resources and also require a great deal of control over the exact type of operation that is conducted. And that feeds into what you can and cannot get maybe from the private sector or other actors. Now, if we want to analyze this question, I hope that my framework, the patio framework, helps in looking at these different elements. So we can look at to what degree the private sector can provide, the people, your exploits, your tooling, your infrastructure, and potentially help with some organizational efforts as well. Now, when you think about the people, right, and I'm leaving out a discussion here on reserve forces. When you think about people, we know of cases where former intelligence officers have actively helped in setting up an intelligence capability for another state. The most famous one is Project Raven, where mostly CIA officers moved to the UAE to help and develop their capabilities there and do operations. Initially, this went under an export license, and later on, potentially that can be debated and discussed. There are a couple of points here. The first one is, and I can't think of a single case, however, where either intelligence or former military officers have moved to another state to actually conduct effect operations for them. And I really think that that's a fundamentally and significant difference. Yes, you can allow and maybe bring in other people. We've seen this and through an export license of not, which can help to set up some of your surveillance tools, but to tell them, well, now you go out and disrupt critical infrastructure and help us in the war against XYZ. At least we haven't seen one of those cases to date. And I think that's an important one. What I discuss in the book is a more theoretical one on like what the private sector can and cannot provide in terms of the overlap. And yes, there is a great deal of overlap in activity, but we also should be mindful of some of the differences in practice that seep in and are created. One that stands out is simply the incentive structure. You see this coming back in the usage of tools, where many of the private sector ultimately are focused on, time and resources and creating an output for, in the case of, doing what we call pen testing activities for a certain target. Whereas for many of the nation states, time and resources is less important. What's crucial is actually your ability to achieve the effect that you want to achieve. And it changes a little bit the way in which you operate. To very briefly move on, I've published a couple of pieces already in the last 1 or 2 weeks around exploits and tooling, or specifically exploits, where my point here is we do as if this is a market that is highly globalized, but reality is, particularly around exploits, it's actually a market that is set up for significant market failures. And to understand this in great detail, the most important thing are the information asymmetries, where often the seller has much more information about it than the buyer can ever have. And through a variety of signaling ways, it can be reduced, but it's really hard to do. And as a result of that, states can go to the private sector, but often are doing this much more locally than is often understood. And not every state, by no means, and we tend to forget this, has access to these local suppliers. Last point, when we then look on the infrastructure side, however, I think this is where you see the biggest opportunity for the private sector to actually supply and provide capabilities. And when we talk about proliferation of capabilities through the private sector, this is the one where I've looked at the least. And this is also where the biggest costs are. So on that one, I'm fully on board with an argument that if someone would say, what can you provide and supply? Yeah, on the infrastructure side, particularly on setting up these cyber ranges, you really can, the private sector plays an absolutely crucial role there.
Thank you. And if I'll just follow up with a different question. So, you touched then on the essential importance of people as a component in this picture, and we've got some questions on that we'll come to in a moment. I was struck by one of your comments about persistent engagement. Right? So this is the US doctrine that essentially says we'll have sort of constant cyber activity engaging with our adversaries online, rather than, if you like, holding our cyber weapons at readiness for some larger conflict. And interestingly, one of the points you make about the advantages of persistent engagement is it actually keeps people, your operators, doing stuff. And so the more they're doing stuff, the more engaged they are, the more interested they are, the more likely you are to retain them. So that's an interesting point. I just wanted to ask you a broader question, which is, given your kind of thesis about the real challenges involved in launching and conducting cyber operations, cyber effects operations, what's your view about persistent engagement as a doctrine? Is it Is it meaningful? Is it even practical for the United States? Is it practical for what one might call second-tier countries, given these constraints? And if not, have you seen something that you think, yes, that's a sort of doctrine of use that makes sense for second-tier countries?
Yeah, that's a big question,
Yeah.
and one that I, over the years, have tried to write on from different parts. And let me take it in a couple of different parts. So persistent engagement and defend forward of US DoD was a strategy that came out in 2018, which an underlying change in understanding, where indeed the focus was very much on activity below the threshold of armed attack that can still be strategically meaningful. And the idea of the US Cyber Command is that you want to operate globally, continuously, and seamlessly to disrupt adversaries' capabilities primarily, instead of deterring. And so, yes, you've got a role where US Cyber Command not just gets into foreign networks for intelligence collection, but also to maybe achieve effects. Wherever that adversary maneuvers, that could be in adversarial networks, but it might also be in networks of allies. Because, if you set up a command and control infrastructure, for instance, in the Netherlands or in Denmark, and then use that to potentially target Russian, US entities, that's a key aspect. Now, the debate around persistent engagement has moved across different levels. One is it escalatory or not? The current evidence hasn't showcased significant escalation resulting from potentially behavior that you can call persistent engagement. That's early evidence. Let's see how that works out. My own contribution to this has been twofold initially. The first one is, okay, if you're going to argue that you want to engage, if you have this understanding that the threat landscape is about this activity below the threshold of armed attack that can still be strategically meaningful, and you have to contest it, it's really unclear what you're not going to contest. So it's not so much that the red lines are unclear, it's unclear what other adversaries are allowed to basically do. Because if I am China or Russia or any other country, I would only do behavior that is strategically meaningful for me, yeah, perhaps cumulative. And it makes it really hard to prioritize on what you will and what you will not disrupt, and where the space of supposed agreed competition is that persistent engagement scholars talk about. The second, my own contribution, which is very much focused on this potential for allied friction. Yes, perhaps you want to engage with your adversaries wherever they maneuver. But again, that might be in also allied networks. And in fact, if I know that a country follows a strategy of persistent engagement, I might see additional reasons to actually operate or use allies as hop-off points, because I know it can create diplomatic friction. And so those are kind of two key elements here, why I think you have to be cautious of it. Now, to your question on should middle powers or smaller states do this as well? Well, even the US, you may question to what degree they can truly operate globally, seamlessly, and continuously, right? And the way that they've ruled this out is that first, the main cyber mission forces focus on Russia. You will see now an increasing focus on China. You're going to focus on Iran, North Korea. But can you truly do this on a global scale and can you disrupt, at all time? That's highly questionable. And the way and where the amount of resources that most other cyber commands have now invested in, they will first have to even operate, on a perhaps very occasional basis, let alone that they can do the operational tempo that potentially persistent engagement requires. So with the resources right now, I see it's simply impossible to do so, even if they would want it. But yes, and just to confirm your point, yeah, and indeed, whilst I'm so skeptical about it, you do have an organization that does have a peacetime mission. And that suddenly changes the way in which, again, you can recruit, retrain, and train talent. And that's a fundamental problem that many of the other countries face today.
Very much. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to open questions up to the room here. Is there a microphone? Yep, brilliant. So we've got gentleman down here. If you'd just like to say who you are, where you're from, and then pose your question.
Hi, I'm Andrew Dwyer from Durham University. And it's picking up on what the discussion was just talking around the capacity for transfer. I'm wondering whether it's better to think about it through deconfliction about how military cyber forces may work together, but not through the explicit sharing of exploits. I'm wondering what you might think about that. And on the point around, you were saying around the kind of allied frictions, how do you think the hunt forward kind of proposals with allied states is maybe changing some of that friction for the US?
Yeah, so on the first point, right, on deconfliction, that's ultimately the area that NATO has moved into as well, right? So NATO has established a new principle around sovereign cyber effect operations. And the principle is that NATO allies can sign up to provide their sovereign cyber effects to the alliance, and then the new Cyber Operations Center in Mons can either request or coordinate the usage of these sovereign cyber effects. And the reason that it's set up in this way, that you're coordinating cyber effects instead of coordinating capabilities, is for the exact reason that I just mentioned. The moment you're going to share your tradecraft, it may reduce that usage of that same tradecraft in the future. To date, we haven't seen any, I can't think of any effect operations that has gone through this principle. And we'll have to see if this is really workable in the future. One of the key aspects here, and I think it's often forgotten, is that sure, initially 9 countries, and I think now the number of countries has significantly increased. But as I hope also that becomes clear from the book, is saying that you may want to, that you are able to provide cyber effect operations when the need arises is one thing. Actually being able to deliver it is another. And there is a clear signaling game going on where it's so hard to signal with your actual capabilities that many of these public statements are truly important as a demonstration of either your willingness or your capacity. But we should take this perhaps with, I wouldn't say it's all bark and no bite, but with a grain of salt. So that's one. But where significant coordination can then still come in, and we have seen this, and we, at least from public reporting, we know that this had to happen in a number of key operations. So there's this terrific resource that I would recommend anyone to look at from the National Security Archive in the US, where they provide highly detailed, or they provide a lot of documentation, although a lot of it is redacted, on JTF errors, which is the US Cyber Command operations against ISIS. And here you see quite a few slides around deconfliction, particularly with the Israelis and with the Dutch. Now, the exact nature of that coordination remains publicly unclear, but clearly, it's an essential element for allies to do so, if alone, not just to coordinate your effects, but to ensure that you're not tripping over some key intelligence operation that your ally is doing and conducting at the same time. So that's your first one. On hunt forward, so a lot has been made of the, particularly the Sky News reports, the 2 interviews with General Nakasone that came out over the last few weeks, where General Nakasone admitted hunt forward operations in Ukraine that ended just before the invasion. And hunt forward operations are interesting. What they do is primarily around malware collection, where the United States collaborates with some key allies in finding out potentially adversarial activity on their systems that can then help them collect relevant malware, and that you're going to use what we call to burn some of their capabilities. But the point here is it's quite a limited type of allied coordinated activity. So in the case of the Sky News report, what is then still unclear is we likely know that the US has conducted some effect operations after the hunt forward operation ended. But the exact nature of that coordination after, that is not spelled out by Nakasone, and it's not really been picked up by reports either. And I think that's where the key kind of, rubber hits the road, where it's like, yeah, sure, you go in and it helps, it's kind of mutually beneficial. It provides great visibility for the United States. But there is really still then a question of which we have no public knowledge. I don't, perhaps other people do, of course, on okay, but once you then start to execute effect operations and disrupt, how do you coordinate them? And that's an open question in this specific case.
Thank you. So just follow up on that with an online question. So obviously, Ukraine, you touched on that just there, and I think there'll be many years of analysis of the cyber dimension of the Ukraine conflict, along with all the other dimensions, obviously, and a terrible conflict it is. Thomas Harding has put forward a question online. I mean, what are your perspectives of the cyber dimensions of Ukraine? I mean, clearly it's very early to try and draw lessons, but there's clearly lots of activity of one sort or another has happened. So anything that you would draw attention to from that? What do you find most interesting about it?
I'll first tell you what I find least interesting about it. And that's the whole discussion about whether this is cyber war or not. So let's park that question because, the conceptual debate. And let's actually look indeed as to some of the kind of interesting elements that are going on. There, as you say, there are really numerous, but let me pick up on perhaps three. The first one is around Russian tooling, where you see some of their usage of wipers. So wipers are malware that manipulates data and most often deletes it, has been quite incredible in terms of the number of variations that we have seen. I've lost count, but we're now at 7+ different wipers. That's really a lot for anyone who has studied this in terms of the number of variations. But what is interesting here is, if you look at them individually, you will say, well, this is not overly sophisticated and perhaps a lot less than we expected, maybe from an advanced and unconstrained actor that Russia is. But at the same time, you can say, well, this is exactly really smart in the way that they've established this, which are relatively simple, I wouldn't say even dirty malware, which with just one module, one focus, one goal, and they move on. And yes, they get burned, but they can do these variants on such a frequent basis that you can have an operational tempo that is not needed in peacetime, but certainly is needed in wartime. So I think that's one, interesting element that has often been missed. The second is, whilst I, with my lens, think so much about effect operations, then are they not, going to take down another satellite system or not? We have to acknowledge that, of course, one of the key things here is the amount of data leaks that have taken place over the past 3+ months as well, that we have not even started to analyze and understand the impact of that, and even organizational friction that creates from simply phone calls between or KGB officers, in Belarus with not their wives, but whatever secret mistresses. You have no idea what this is doing at home, and there is so much of it, and I've seen so little analysis of the strategic implications of it, but that's really crucial. Last point is about the Ukrainian IT army and some of the other non-state actors that immediately were put in this bucket of cyber proxies, and immediately were put in this bucket of this huge army that can operate against Russia, or of course some proxies that can operate in favor of Russia. I hope there is some cautious there in how we study them, and I really think there is so much interesting diversity there and organizational setups that hasn't been discussed or hasn't been analyzed in sufficient detail, that for years to come provides a fantastic area of research, perhaps one that maybe Rusi can take up as well.
Great. I think it's all spot on. I think your point about thinking about cyber effects as being a much broader set of activities than simply, turning off the power, ... And the cognitive effect, I think, is really interesting. A strong point. Just on your final point there, do you, obviously early days, are you seeing, do you have a sense that there are strategic shifts in the relationships or the nature of these non-state groups, criminal groups, activist groups, their relationships with nation states? Is that changing our perception, or is this sort of what we'd expect to see, do you think?
So again, you would it's hard to make a huge generalized statement here, but let's take two that one I've studied in great detail, which is a cyber partisans that is actually in Belarus, and but let's stick with the one that most often comes up first, the Ukrainian IT army, where the writing of this is very much one of headlines such as 400,000 people have joined the Ukrainian IT army and are going to do operations. But actually, anyone who looks into this in detail will say, well, actually, this is fascinating. You've got this really small core of government-based employees that try to do more advanced operations. And so far, we don't know of a case where they truly succeeded. And then, yeah, they are with their back against the wall, want to use non-state actors from across the world, but equally, they are quite cautious and unsure on how to use them. So you've got this huge group around it that, you know, from all the way the outer layer of people that have simply signed up to Signal chat or Telegram chat, to this group where, yeah, what can you really do with them? Well, you do want to keep control over your operations. You don't want to have just like whatever, an X number of hackers, supposedly part of the IT army, go and take down infrastructure in Russia if they would actually be able to do it. So ultimately, much of what it is sign up to one big botnet, and you know that's what you provide. And then what the media makes of it is, well, thousands of people are hacking for the IT army. Well, no, this is a really interesting relationship between how a state is trying to leverage non-state hackers and struggles to put them in that moment into a really interesting framework and can use them effectively. And so I'm not saying they can't be meaningful at all, but that study and that relationship is one that we need to delve into in much greater detail in the future.
Yeah, we've got to get below the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Anybody else? Anyone else in the room with a question?
Thank you. I'm Julia from the University of Oxford. I have a question, sort of two questions broadly about interdependence and how that might, if at all, sort of shape this dynamic of sort of capabilities and constraints and unconstrained actors. And first, I was wondering if at all weaponized interdependence or global interdependencies with respect to the infrastructure side of your framework, how that might influence that. And I'm thinking how cyber and digital development sort of intersect during peacetime. And I know that's slightly beyond the military side, but it does have military implications. And secondly, I was wondering about external capacity building projects that a lot of these sort of more capable state actors have funded in Africa, and the extent to which this might influence sort of the hub and spoke model and capabilities down the line. So, and what I'm wondering is about whether or not you train. So for example, the EU has these projects and the US, etc. And a lot of these projects are centered around the to train principle. So training local elites on matters of capacity building, as well as funding infrastructure. And I'm wondering if this would influence sort of the lock-in effects later down the line, and whether this could influence capabilities not only for the state, the more capable states, but also with their sort of alliances with respect to deconfliction.
Yeah. So on your first question, for those unfamiliar maybe with the academic debate, the concept of weaponized interdependence primarily came up in an article in International Security that is absolutely terrific by Farrell and Newman, where they talk about how interdependence is increasingly weaponized, whether that's through sanctions or other elements, and that we have to consider here. So I'm trying to link this to the infrastructure side. There is one. This is not my argument. This would be the argument that that some others have made, most prominently John Lindsay and Eric Goske, to scholars, where they say, well, interdependence fundamentally creates a dampening effect because fundamentally, yes, we're all interdependent, but this is by choice, right? You decide to connect or not to connect, and you decide to go digital or not. And so if it's truly at some point the cost outweighed the benefits, you no longer do so. And so the interdependence creates opportunities for weaponization, but also kind of vice versa. That would be their argument. And I haven't fully thought this through, and this is certainly not something that I'm in any discussion have in my book, but increasingly I'm like, yeah, is that so? And the reason why I say this is that I really think that oftentimes digitalization is almost no option. And of course, the most obvious example would be Iranian usage of such a, for instance, Siemens software for their nuclear centrifuges. They don't have an option to use certain software if they want to go nuclear. Now you can then say, well, that's then a choice, but really, you know, to develop any type of capacity, you have to digitize in some way, and that provides the new opportunities for exploitation. And so I find this argument that has been made there a bit too easy. I don't think that often digitization is a simple choice or no choice. On your second point on capacity building, so to be clear, this book is really on that offensive focused element, right? And any of the capacity building efforts that we have seen today are very much on the defensive side of things. And so it's not something that I discuss here. I certainly do agree with you, though. Yeah, much of the capacity building can potentially create lock-in effects, and we should be aware of it, that you may have a research institution that is doing some work around capacity building that provides the maturity of, provides an assessment of the maturity of a certain country, their cyber maturity, but it's equally sponsored by, of course, a whole range of private sector companies then say, well, to increase your maturity level, here are all the supplies that you need from these companies that are funding our research. So that's one. At the same time, what is fascinating is I was at a capacity building project last week in Brussels with a range of representatives from Africa. They say one of the key things that stood out is, well, we are particularly wary of using potentially technologies that you're not even using yourself, right? And so there is that kind of element there too, where, you know, we don't want to have this kind of secondary kind of technology. Oh yeah, we don't even embed it in our systems, but it's good enough for you. So there's that element there too.
Great, thank you. So a couple of questions from people online. These are sort of around structural organization kind of issues. So Chris Moore asks, so cyber is an operational domain in its own right, anyway, NATO says so, but it's also permeates all other domains ubiquitously, right? So organizationally, where should a cyber force, a military force, hybrid force, other forces are available, where should a cyber force be located? Is it centralized? Is it decentralized? Is it distributed across other domains? So do you have views on that from your research? And then a kind of follow-up question from Roger Hood, who's really interested in your thoughts on cyber reserves. So military cyber reserves, I mean, kind of feel potentially very different from conventional military reserves. One could argue one way or the other. What views have you got about how cyber reserves can best be structured, located, brigaded, organized to get the best value?
Yeah, let me start with the second one on reserves. And indeed, what I've explained, right? If people, the recruitment, training, and retention of people is one of the key issues. Indeed, one of the ways in which countries have tried to resolve this, well, we can focus and we can use reserves. And there are different models that exist across different countries, whether you look at Switzerland or the Netherlands or Estonia and so on. There are a couple of problems that come up. So let's first answer the question directly. Where do they most valuably come in? Well, actually not on the offensive side, but on the defensive side, on the forensic side. So there's a huge benefits and opportunities there. And the reserves model, I would argue, can be very beneficial. On the offensive side, however, there are significant limits. And that comes back to the key principle about operational activity. Operations is about understanding the target network of your adversary better than they do themselves. And that often requires really intricate understanding of, you know, not just the systems, but even the people who operate them, what passwords they use, what are their routines, all of those questions. That is not often done overnight, but it is done, of course, in a long set of activity in which you try and like familiarize yourself with those systems. The danger with a reserve model is to think that you can potentially have a time of, and I'm exaggerating it, plug and play solution, that these can come in when needed to help you with an effect operation. And that's realistic, that's quite unrealistic, in addition to a host of practical problems, whether that's the screening of your reserves for a specific operation, the way in which they can fit into certain cultures at the given moment in time, work shoulder on shoulder with some of the key people that you have, where we see already that so many teams do have big communication problems for a host of personal reasons, of the type of people that you bring in and how they have trained their communication skills before, to generally lack of understanding sometimes in leadership. So it's really, you know, as Jamie Collier here in the audience has once said before, it's by no means a silver bullet. And there is a role for them, but it's way more limited and much more on the defensive side and much less on the offensive side than people think it is. And then, sorry, the second question, okay, then where should a military cyber command be located? And here I don't want to be annoying, but and this is something that I don't sufficiently address in the book. Perhaps, you know, it's the second one that I'll write on that, is ultimately, it then, of course, does depend on the cyber posture of the certain state and what it wants to achieve. I don't want to make a normative argument that some country that it's worse or better to have a military that just does a very specific type of effect operations that only focuses on supporting military forces during wartime. It could be the right thing to do, but it's very different than having an operation or having a command that says, actually, our understanding of this landscape and so on is that you need to persistently engage and so on. And the way in which you structure them is fundamentally different. Whereas one you might actually put with the, you know, your special forces. I think there is a lot of opportunities there. The other you're going to do as a complete separate entity under the chief of staff that has a close link to the intelligence. So it's a bit tricky there, and it fundamentally depends on the goal you want to achieve in the long and short term.
Just a related question from Gunyeok Lee, who's put it online. I mean, you clearly, you know, you looked at a lot of countries. You've looked at a lot of different approaches. Have you, you know, what do you think determines? He asks. Or she asks, what do you think determines the degree to which a state's focus on cyber is offensive orientated or defensive orientated? I mean, do you see, you know, what is it that leads countries to invest or seek to invest or talk about investing in offensive cyber capabilities as opposed to those who sort of say, no, that's not for us?
So it's fascinating. And here is why I love this question. 10 years ago, my research was very much focused on exactly what motivates countries to do so. And I've increasingly moved to this, what I felt preliminary question on, like, okay, what are the requirements? Of course, when we look at just kind of an overview of where are these cyber commands established, the greatest density of commands you will find amongst NATO members, right? And that also has to do with organizational structures in other countries, but that's interesting. Now, one thing that is interesting is when they were established and then how they connect to each other. The first when is many of them were established, note, after the financial crisis with big defense budget cuts. And so you've got this time of austerity where many countries were selling a wide number of military equipment, but then also put in their speech as well, but we're going to invest in the future and in a modern warfighting capability. And, you know, we're going to spend between, you know, in some countries, 3 million to 20 million in cyber. And that's going to, you know, do that. So in a way, you know, you've got this push for cyber because of this almost at the time in which they were established, where it's like, hey, we can still be a modern force. We can still be at the forefront of warfighting by, you know, investing relatively little money in this cyber capability. So that's one interesting element. And then you can appoint a 3-star general that sits there and goes to meetings, can say, you know, hey, we are at the forefront of this, again, modern warfighting. What is fascinating is now, if you would think about motivations, sure, the more common dynamic is to say, well, there is this threat. We've seen perhaps Russian activity, North Korean activity, or increasingly Iranian or Chinese activity picking up. And as a result of that, we're going to establish a command to potentially, you know, also operate in this space, maybe counter it. Typical national security argument. Perhaps, certainly, I wouldn't say that is not there, but there is another one, and that's a socialization dynamic. It's very much one where clearly, because the French, the Germans, the Dutch, the Danes, Norway, although it has a slightly different mandate, Estonia has set it up. Belgium now can't be like, we can't stay behind. In simple terms, we want to be part of this club too. And so there is clearly a socialization element there that is driving some of this proliferation among allies too.
Absolutely. Thank you. Any other questions in the room? Okay, so we've got plenty of online questions. You talked a lot about people, and you talk a lot in the book about people as being at the core of this. We've had a number of questions about, how to get the most out of people, particularly perhaps in a context where, as an organization, you're not doing a lot of live operations. So Malcolm Waugh, for example, has talked about how the Royal Navy and the US Navy work up themselves, working with people around training, very people-focused training, and that's kind of a deep part of how they operate. We've had questions about, what have you seen as being good ways that nations have adopted to retain people? You talk about the retention problem. What are your views then on how should nations that are operating in this arena recruit, retain, keep people interested? How do they address that issue? And, is there anything else you want to say about whether they can look for that kind of resource and effort in different ways, use more innovative approaches? Thoughts on that?
So clearly, I feel if I would point to one of the areas for future kind of development and research, is indeed exactly this, like looking in great depth at other research and other practices around the retention and business practices too, that in some ways can and cannot inform this for cyber commands. A couple of thoughts here. The first one is the most obvious one, which is set up infrastructure of which your operators can and your developers and so on can truly train on. And this means not just a $1-2 million cyber range, but develop something that is truly allows people to do month-long almost exercises on your training infrastructure, such as the US has now done, US Army in particular, with $1 billion investment. Now, nothing of that kind you almost see in any other country. But it's an obvious one, but it's a necessary one here. So that's the first. The second is a tricky one. I haven't spelled it out as a dilemma in my book as explicitly, but when I now think about it, is that the relationship with the private sector, where there's some overlap in activities. In some ways, you can say, well, you can either have them work in the private sector for a while and then go back to Cyber Command, or you kind of make sure that this training nicely overlaps. And whilst I see the opportunities there also have been a number of clear cases where this has led to significant losses in your best talent too, right? You go and have private sector people work, Cyber Command people work in the private sector for these semi-internships that exist, and then or have them provide these almost sometimes free trainings and sometimes paid trainings, and then after this internship or whatever training has ended, half of your staff is gone and have moved to this company. And so I'm not saying they shouldn't work together, but it's a real issue that we see and face today, and I don't have a good answer on how to deal with this. The third one here is then, to what degree, and I think there is a lot more that can be done here, more formalized long-term trainings programs can be established. And still in many countries, and this is the basics, you've got people that do 6-week programs and then are pushed into a cyber command. But we should take this serious. And if we really believe that this is a separate service and so on, make them at a minimum year-long dedicated services and programs where you say, okay, we pay for this, we may even pay for further education, but there is also then, of course, a requirement that you may stay for X number of years. And in many of these cases, that doesn't really exist right now.
Yeah, very good. Well, I'm afraid we have run out of time. Thank you very much for that, Max. It was very, very interesting, fantastic, and really interesting questions. Thank you for those who have asked questions, sent questions in. Sorry we didn't be able to get to all of them, but we could carry on as ever for much longer. But I'm really grateful for you coming along. Really good, interesting book. I think I strongly recommend it. Thanks for joining us in person. Thanks for joining us online, and please keep an eye out on the RUSI Cyber website for information about future events. And